attention to tonight.
Capital punishment is detrimental to our society. Currently, there are 32 states in the United States that allow capital punishment. Capital punishment is more expensive than life without parole, and the application of capital punishment is also full of inequality. Since the death penalty was reinstated in 1978, California has spent roughly $4 billion in associated costs. Only 13 executions have taken place. In a 2001 study in California of costs, Judge Arthur McArchon and Paula Mitchell found that the current backlog of death penalty cases, 714, would take at least 20 years before the cases are resolved. Nearly $2 billion of the $4 billion spent in California were for pretrial and trial costs due to multiple factors such as extra attorneys, extended jury selections, and multiple experts. Housing is also more expensive than life without parole due to the added security measures required and single prisoner cells. In Colorado, housing a death prisoner is roughly 17% more expensive than housing an inmate as part of the general population. An official from California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation in 2011 estimated that death row inmates cost approximately $90,000 more per year than the rest. In 2009, the average time in death row was 14 years and 1 month. The application of capital punishment is full of inequality. Whether a person receives a death sentence depends heavily upon where the crime was committed. Texas, Oklahoma, Georgia, Virginia, Montana, and Florida, primarily southern states, have the highest levels of death sentences. It is expected to see variation in death sentences from state to state due to differences in laws, populations, and crime rates. However, within a single state, you would expect little to no variation, but that is not always the case. An investigation by 7 Indiana newspapers in 2001 found that 2 counties in Indiana had almost as many death sentences as all the other counties combined. A 2001 report from the Capital Defendant's Office in New York showed that 61% of all capital prosecutions occurred in upstate counties, but they only accounted for 19% of the homicides. Modern society studies consistently show that those who kill white victims are much more likely to receive the death penalty than those who kill African American victims. Racial disparity in sentences and executions suggests that race plays a role in the application of the death penalty. A North Carolina study from 1980 to 2007 found that the odds of receiving a death sentence was 3 times higher if the convicted defendant was convicted of killing a white victim than if he had killed an African American victim. The majority of capital punishment laws are in regards to murder. A single murder can lead to a death sentence. However, a person convicted of several murders can also receive a life sentence. Gary Ridgway, convicted of 49 murders, received a life without parole sentence. Andrew Crawford, convicted of 11 murders, also received a life sentence. Capital punishment is detrimental to our society due to the higher cost of the life without parole sentence and its application being full of inequality. Thank you.
All right, Thomas, you start with the proposition. There's not really much lead into it, but the proposition's clearly stated as a claim of fact. That's fine. And then you start dumping in some data, some factual data about prosecutions, number of cases, costs. I think you've got some secondary issues here, but they are not signposted, they're not identified as declarative sentences, and as a consequence, material runs together. You've got several places where you're citing pieces of information, and I know that there's an inference to be drawn from that, but you need to state that inference instead of assuming that we're going to figure it out. And then sometimes you do state an inference, but you don't always tell us what the information is that's supporting that point, and then sometimes we're going back and forth between issues. The cost issue comes up in a couple of different places. The fairness, I don't want to say fairness issue, but for instance, the issue of inequality of application. You're giving me at one point stuff about upstate prosecutions in Indiana, and that's unfair. And then you've got some other issues that you present. And then later on, we've got an argument about some people who committed multiple murders who don't get death sentences. And I guess that seems to suggest that there's something inconsistent about the way it's being applied also. And that's an example of places where information should be grouped together and it should be building for a single claim, and instead it's being dispersed here. The information on the race issues, I think, is, it's sign reasoning that's going on here. I think there's a lot of reasons that might explain some of the differences that you have here, and you don't really go into depth there, except you just kind of present the data and assume that means that there is some kind of either racial bias that's going on, discriminatory prosecution, something along those lines. And there may be, but I think you need more data than the data that you're presenting on those particular points. In California, for instance, the cost issue is an interesting point, but I'm not exactly sure why it's important. You're saying it's detrimental because we can't afford it, we don't have the money for these kinds of things. I'm not sure why, because death penalty cases cost more. In essence, it's a disadvantage because the courts screw things up, not because of the penalty itself, but because of the way those things are done. It seems like you're suggesting if we didn't do this, then we wouldn't have those pretrial costs, we wouldn't have all of the appeals, and people would be sentenced to life imprisonment faster and cheaper, and I guess that's a good thing, although I'm not exactly sure how good that is for the fairness of the trial. So I think there's a potential inconsistency there. It doesn't necessarily address an issue that you brought up, but it might be an issue that would be brought up by somebody responding to your point. All right, thank you.